And just so you're clear, yeah, I'm speaking now as Dan Rasky, private citizen. I work for NASA and have for 30 years, but in this venue, I'm speaking for myself only and not for the agency.
Okay. So, so last time we, talked about a lot of different things, and you touched on, some of the events that you recalled in which Elon Musk exhibited various forms of leadership. And I wanted to drill into that a little bit if I could. And, ask if, whether your impression is that that leadership style that he exhibited was copied by other people, or if it was kind of unique to him, or did people did it sort of set the tone? Did you see other people kind of behaving the same way?
Yeah, I mean, in general, in my experience is that the leadership tends to set the style for the people below them. The other people below the leader try to emulate either consciously or unconsciously kind of the style of the leadership. In Elon's case, so he's so unique. There's a certain amount, I think, that people tried to emulate. I'm trying to think of Gwen or Tom Mueller, who I worked with, and somewhat similar that they, would try to set, kind of top level goals and then give people a lot of room below that, but still make people accountable to those goals, right? So, so keep that promise or make sure you under promise. So yeah, from that standpoint, yes. From the kind of the problem solving aspect, because that's what Elon does. He problem solves. If there's a problem, he pulls together the right information, the right people, and tries to come up with a solution. So yeah, so there's various aspects, yes, that people emulated. The work ethic, OMG, he does work harder than anyone else in the organization. I mean, that is not an exaggeration. He has said that, and that is so true. So and that kind of leads to the type of people that can kind of exist in that environment. You find that there's a fair number of empty nesters. Okay, so people kind of at the end of their careers, and then a fair number of early career people. So essentially, by and large, what I observe, people that don't have a lot of family obligations, because that's kind of hard to weave family obligations into meeting your work obligations when you're working for Elon. And I don't think that's a secret to anyone. So so yeah, there's a number of aspects of the way that he operates and the importance that he puts on, a number of elements kind of being emulated from that standpoint.
Interesting. And how does that impact the the reporting structure? Is there a hierarchy, or does everybody just work for SpaceX and move around? How do they organize people?
Well, again, and this is back for me when I had a lot of contact with them back in 2008, so it may have evolved since then. But again, it was a lot like a software startup. Okay, so in other words, a lot of Indians and just a couple of chiefs. Okay, right? I guess that's really a good way to put it, and a lot of fluidity between groups. Okay, and you're right. In most cases, people had most of their allegiance to the activity they were working on rather than the group they were part of. Okay, now they were your structures or avionics, but that's almost like a secondary or tertiary consideration compared to what are you working on and who are you working with. And that's where, by the way, when I first started working there back in late 2007, 2008, when I had that big bullpen in Hawthorne, the cubicles. And at first I really didn't like the cubicles because I'm used to having a little bit more, privacy in an office. And I thought, okay, well, this is going to be kind of annoying having people around and noise. But you quickly learn, particularly the way that they work, that it's a really efficient way to get things done. Because I remember a number of times, I'd be working on something and I had a question. I knew I had a question for, and you could literally stand up from your cubicle and look to see if that person was at their desk. You know, if I need John Smith or whatever. So you go over and you talk to them and you get your question answered and you come back and work. Or if you go over and talk to this other person that says, oh, we need to talk to, you know, a third person, then you together go over and to the third person. So very quickly you find, oh, you have all these ad hoc kind of meetings, impromptu meetings, which are really efficient for time, both your time and their time, because just the people that need to be involved are involved, and as quickly as possible you exchange the information that needs to be exchanged, and then you can go back, you know, and do your own work once again. And man, that's an efficient way to move information around. And I think I might mention to you, or mention one of my other videos, that, you know, here we are, it still blows my mind thinking about it. Here we are doing a flight heat shield for Dragon, the primary heat shield and the secondary, the aft heat shield. And this is, okay, it's a cargo vehicle, but it with also, you know, one of the stipulations Elon had is, you know, that it's crew rateable for returns from the moon. Okay, so he can do lunar returns from it. And it has to be integrated with all the other subsystems, and, you know, we got to do the scale up and then do the mass production, and then be able to do the design, certification, and compatibility with all the other subsystems. And with all of that going on, we had one standing meeting a week. One, okay, not 15, okay, at NASA. If we were working the same project, oh my God, we'd have a dozen standing meetings, you know, and with maybe tens or hundreds of people in each of those meetings, you know, and most people has to do with statusing, right? So most of the time you're sitting and listening, right? Because someone else is talking. And then you find that there's very little time for you to work on your own, because you're going from one status meeting to another status meeting to another status meeting.
Yeah.
And so here at SpaceX, we have one standing meeting a week, 11 a.m. on a Wednesday. Okay, so it's in the middle of the week, so you can kind of status in the middle. And it was at 11 a.m. so that 12, you know, when 12 noon came along, everyone wanted to adjourn so we could go have lunch. Okay, and that was it. And that was enough. And I remember thinking at first, when I first was doing it, okay, there's just no way. There's just too many things on requirements and other coordination. How is this going to happen with just one standing meeting a week? And then you quickly learn, oh, standing meetings are really inefficient for actually passing around critical information. It's funny that it's counterintuitive.
Yeah.
Because the whole idea of a lot of these status meetings, okay, everyone needs to hear this. Well, actually not. Okay, actually, for most information, there's a very small set of people that need to have that information. And if you bring them in, they have that information and you can move on, and other people aren't wasting their time hearing information they don't need to hear. So it was one of those counterintuitive aspects that after living it, oh, now I get it. Okay, minimize your standing meetings to an absolute minimum.
That's interesting validation, because we talk about that a lot in this book. That's like a huge topic in this book. And
yes,
you know, I didn't know that story. I hadn't seen your interviews when we wrote that. So that's really kind of interesting validation about that, about standing meetings.
Well, and the other one that goes kind of along with that, okay, with NASA, okay, this is a lot of standing meetings. We will have a huge list of requirements, interface and other requirements for various subsystems. And the whole time I was at SpaceX working on a flight, you know, vehicle heat shield, I never once saw a requirements document. And I remember being a little perplexed by that at first. Okay, well, what are the requirements? Okay, and essentially the requirements were, okay, make a heat shield that's compatible with the other systems, that can do a crew type return from the moon. And I at one point was asking someone, I forget if it was Tom Mueller or Andrew Chambers, you know, I brought it up, you know, it's interesting. And that's, we'd have like, oh my goodness, we have pages and pages of requirements, you know, and are we meeting that requirement or not? Here it's essentially, you know, this thing that you can just remember. And the response was, well, that's the way we do it here. And the comment was, if if the requirements are more complex than what you can keep in your head, they aren't going to be affecting decisions. I thought, oh, that's true. In other words, when you're making decisions, you're typically making decisions based on, okay, what is relevant that you can keep on top of mind, right? And if you can't keep it on top of mind, okay, it doesn't become part of your decision. It becomes part of your explanation. And we at NASA, what do we talk about? Is this a reason or an excuse? Okay, so is it something that actually led to a decision, or is it something that you try to explain as a result of a decision? Okay, and I having experienced that, oh, that's true. In so many cases, okay, even when you have pages and pages of requirements, it turns out if you actually look at the decisions being made, they're typically driven by a very small set of considerations. That's what drives the decision. And then all the other requirements are kind of waived or excused or whatever, that are consistent with whatever the decision that was made. So in other words, you end up with all these lists of requirements that aren't really driving the decision processes, okay? And that are similar to these standing meetings are generating a lot of work and a lot of needless attention that could be better applied to actually the design decisions themselves. So yeah, very interesting on both of those. And then there's one third piece that I should mention that that is kind of the same way relevant. When we were first working on this, when I first got into SpaceX, I remember hearing about Elon using LabVIEW to do his all his launch software and control, programming, and remember hearing from colleagues, in NASA and more traditional aerospace companies, that's crazy. LabVIEW for your launch control system, that's can't work. You can't make that work. There are too many criticalities and so on. No, this is something that you need to be down at the sea level or whatever. There's no way you can do launch control of a complex launch vehicle with LabVIEW. And I remember bringing that up with a couple of my colleagues there, and they said, well, we've done it. Okay, what do you mean you can't do it? We've done it. And apparently this was one of those things early on that Elon, he saw no reason why should we go to the expense and difficulty of having our own, we call them one-man dog software design solution when we can use a modular approach, which will make it more efficient for developing and maintaining and modifying the software. And so yeah, they were doing all this stuff at SpaceX with LabVIEW, and they had the full set of all the modules and extensions, and you could literally go to the supply depot and get whatever you wanted. And boy, did that speed up all types of software activities because you weren't writing all your native code. You were doing these blocks together via LabVIEW for lab type control. But they were launching rockets with it. It's like, and
I think that actually is kind of an interesting approach because that's intended for real. It's visual. It's a model-driven architecture tool, and you can see all the error paths and everything.
Yes. Yeah, it simplifies it dramatically. And I had, oh my God, I had cut my teeth in the aerospace industry with these we call one-man dog code. I remember one of the first codes I worked on was in Fortran 66 with arithmetic ifs. Okay, and if you want to describe hell to doing software work, arithmetic ifs. That's it's greater than 0, equals 0, less than 0, and then 3 numbers behind it that had to do with 3 line control numbers that would go to depend on whether it was greater than 0.
I remember that. I remember that.
God.
Yeah.
And it turns into this spaghetti, coding that's almost impossible to follow, and so many error paths that even we took this code and tried to put it through one of these automated flowchart generators, and it crashed. The flowchart generator was so complex. The flowchart generator said,
"You must have had a race condition."
But I mean, it was actually an important piece of software. Oh my God, it was just a nightmare to work on. Okay, and So yeah, so Elon, again, being a software guy, he, let's use modern tools rather than defaulting to these other tools. And one other piece then, okay, because it plays along with this. One of the things I found about Elon, he is very suspicious of conventional wisdom. In fact, in almost every case where I've worked with him, he'll take conventional wisdom and literally throw it out the window, okay? And what he does then, he does his own, what you can call first principles assessment. He essentially says, okay, conventional wisdom, forget that. Let me see if I can derive what are the important parameters from first principles consideration that will lead me to an answer. And he does one other thing that a lot of people don't realize. Once he's done his own first principles assessment and come up with, okay, here's an approach I think that this work, then he actually takes the devil's advocate position and tries to argue himself out of it. Tries to see, okay, what are the arguments I can put up against this approach that would argue for a different approach? And if he can't argue himself out of his preferred solution, then he goes with it. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why he's been so successful, because there's so many aspects of conventional wisdom, particularly in a really high-tech, fast-moving area like aerospace, that end up being wrong, okay? And if you aren't, really diligent between, okay, what's actually a useful approach versus what is just that archaic approach that's holding me up, you can waste a lot of time and money. So
Well,
that's another thing that he does.
Does he include other people to help him think through, like help him pick it apart? Like how does he bring other people into the thought process?
Well, again, the one that I saw was that one thing where he was trying to decide on make or buy for Pika. Yeah, and he wanted to get other people's opinion. Now, okay, but let me put this. He is so fast intellectually, and so talented intellectually. I've never seen him personally try to bounce his logic off of somebody else. It's more like providing perspectives and input that then he takes in and does the logical progression and comes up with an answer and decides yes or no. And I think that's, again, one of these unique aspects of Elon. He is just so capable intellectually, that he leaves, my experience, he leaves almost everybody else just in the dust. So.
Well, what about other people? I mean, did there tend to be a lot of discussions about whether something would work or not?
Yes, at kind of other folks. Oh yeah, we'd have a lot of technical discussions, kind of more common. Okay, discussing. For example, we had at one point a processing problem with Pika that we weren't getting the uniformity that we needed of this phenolic impregnant. And so yeah, there were like 4 of us sat down and kind of did a skull session. Okay, what do you think it is? And looking at the data. So yeah, no, that's that type of group problem solving that I witnessed a number of times, but not with Elon. Okay, other than people providing perspectives and input, and then him kind of taking that in and coming up with his preferred solution that no one argued with.
And then how do people find out things they need to know that other people are doing that affect them? Like, if suppose someone is doing a model and they decide to change something, but it impinges on something else. How do you find out about that? Is it just listening, or is it them tell you? Kind of, is there a culture around that?
There's a culture of informing, other subsystems that are going to be impacted by your decisions, like that talking about that bulkhead that was undersized and they wanted to put a spacer in, and they didn't just put in the spacer and then us find about it, haphazard. They contacted us. So again, the whole point is, and the incentives are, you want a successful project. Okay, so if your system is going to be impacting or being impacted by something else, then the culture is, okay, you make sure that group knows, at least there's someone in a position of authority that knows that okay, we made this decision and or it's going to impact you, and is that okay? So there's that communication, but it happens on my experience, on an as needed basis. There aren't all these status meetings, and there's some, okay, and again, this was back in 2008. They've gotten to more production, so they may have formalize more of this at this
Right.
point in time. But back in 2008, no, it was very much a kind of collaborative, a grassroots collaborative activity, that was driven. It wasn't really a top-down coordination at that point in time. And by the way, Phil, one of the things I was thinking, and actually I thought this even before I went working at SpaceX, and was kind of confirmed by that. I came to the conclusion, back after I'd been working in the aerospace industry for about a decade, that most of the organizational approach was really driven by the military. That most of the people that were in positions of authority, their first management training was exposure to the military, and essentially the military approach for organizing men, which is very hierarchical, very chain of command, and which is what you need when you have a large group of individuals that you're trying to manage and control to do something that they fundamentally don't want to do, because that's what militaries do.
Right.
And the other thing about militaries is that there's some consideration of efficiency, but more important than efficiency is effectiveness, because if you're effective as a military, you get the spoils of victories. And so efficiency is down the list a lot to just effectiveness of being able to concentrate your resources and so on. And then so that has then followed through my experience to most of the traditional aerospace industry. And with the commercial space startups, almost without exception, they have been individuals, Elon, Jeff Bezos, Maston, who have no military experience. In fact, almost all of them got their management training in the software industry, almost at the other end of the spectrum from a military hierarchical approach to management. Software is very much a lot of Indians, a couple chiefs type of approach, and that you either all succeed together or you all fail together, and very much a trial and error. The whole idea of beta testing, right? You get something that's barely working and you put it out and see, what are features you like about this? What are features you don't like? But really at the opposite end of the spectrum from the traditional military hierarchical approach. And when I went to SpaceX, it was so clear that was so much more the feel and the style of the approach, the software development approach, compared to the traditional aerospace, military model. And I think that was part of what has led to this change and open the door for commercial space, was that this new model. And by the way, there were a lot of folks that were convinced it would fail, convinced that approach, that a lot of Indians and just a few chiefs, that didn't provide enough control and oversight to do something as difficult as aerospace. And Elon and SpaceX have clearly proven that's wrong, because they've done it, and they've done it in spades, and they're running circles around the traditional aerospace approach. And there's no better example than Crew Dragon compared to Starliner. I mean, if you want a stark example of traditional versus new space, well, you just look at Crew Dragon versus Starliner, and Starliner is pretty much a disaster right now. So
I know.
I hope they get it flying.
It costs twice as much, and I think it's 2 years behind or something.
Yeah. No, if you line up, you're exactly right. The promises, the schedule, the budgets, and then the performance, it's an abject failure. I mean, and it just tells you kind of how this new model, is so much outstripping kind of that old traditional model. And that's what we're seeing.
Well, how do people, when you were there, like, how did people learn what they needed to work on? Like, were they given tasks or?
Oh yeah. So the normal folks, they will have a direct report. Like for the folks I was working with, it was funny. Tom Mueller was essentially who we reported to.
Well, that's kind of funny, because he was the rocket scientist, but you were working on a heat shield.
But let me tell you why. Because TPS, thermal protection system, is a very kind of a specialized, you know, technology area. And so when they were working on the Falcon 1 and the Falcon 9, and Elon decided he wanted to do a heat shield for Dragon, because they knew pretty quickly they came to the conclusion they wanted to use an ablative heat shield. Okay. And the only group that had any experience with ablators was the propulsion group, because the Merlin
original Merlin
1A
design was ablative.
it was an ablative thrust chamber. Okay. And so literally the only guys in the shop who could spell ablator, I'm serious, the only ones who could spell ablator were in the propulsion group. And Andrew Chambers, which is interesting because with his name, he did a lot of the work on that ablative thrust chamber, as fate would have it. And so he was given the short stick of being the lead for the thermal protection group because he could spell ablator. And so he reported to Tom. And so we reported to Tom. And so what would happen, we had several other folks too. So they would have, how often did they have kind of a review or a coordination with Tom? Maybe once a week, maybe once every couple weeks.
But who was kind of like overseeing like the TPS?
Andrew. Andrew Chambers at the time was there. Andrew was kind of the nominal lead, although he was like an Indian that only had like a quarter head higher than the other Indians, you know, so he was kind of one of the guys. Okay, but he was the one, and one of his roles were when we came up with something we wanted to buy, if it was over a certain amount, I'm trying to remember what the amount was it 10 grand? There was a price amount that he had authority to make purchases on. I think it was 10 grand, is what I remember right now.
That's
and if
pretty
it was
low.
Yeah, I know. But if it was over 10 grand, then he had to go and get the approval from Tom.
Okay.
And if it was over, I'm trying to remember now, was it 100 grand or some other thing that was over a certain amount, then Tom had to go talk to Elon. So they had kind of these thresholds, procurement thresholds, where they needed to get the concurrence above them for the purchase. They couldn't just go do it on their own. And my recollection is that, see, I didn't have these weekly reviews with Tom because I was essentially supporting Andrew, and Andrew and I talked every day. But I think Andrew talked with Tom was once a week or maybe once every couple of weeks, would have, you know, kind of a one-on-one, like a couple out, and like just sit down with Tom and kind of talk through, okay, where are we at? You know, how are there problems? Are we making appropriate progress? So, and I think Tom did that with the other folks that he had reports with. So again, their whole thing, right, is you're just the people who need to communicate. So don't waste a bunch of people's time. If Tom needs to talk with Andrew, was Tom and Andrew, okay? Or don't need to, other people don't be involved.
But what happened if, you know, because, you know, like you mentioned, if they were, you know, 51% certain about something and was ready to try it, but like, who would decide? You know, what if there wasn't consensus? Who would actually decide?
Well, again, like on most of TPS elements, Andrew would be the one who would make the call. Okay, if there was any dissension, okay, and we'd usually talk through things enough that we kind of come to, okay, we think, yeah, between the three or four of us, okay, we think this is the way to go. A couple of times we had, you know, something that we couldn't quite get consensus, then Andrew would make the call. So he was again had the Indian that had one quarter head above the other. The tiebreaker.
And if it turned out it was a bad call, what happened?
Well, then we'd all, you know, first you all observe together, like, oh, that's not working, and then we back up, okay,
Yeah.
and say, okay, that didn't work. Okay, we had something one time when we were doing the prototype oven that something wasn't working. We tried a couple things, and that didn't work, and so we had to back up a little bit, and we finally found a solution. But a very organic process, okay, you know, very. And again, it's in part because you're all trying to make this thing work. And you know what? Okay, what it is? Okay, here's the other analogy I've seen. If you can get it to be like a pickup game of basketball, things can run very efficiently. And I don't know if you've ever, there's a whole thing about group dynamics where pickup basketball game is very a very good demonstration. Okay, so what happens with the pickup game of basketball? Because there's a couple parameters that you need to have this work. Okay, and okay, so first you have to have a group of individuals, and they all have to want to play the same game. So you can't do a pickup game of basketball if half you want to do baseball, and the other third one to soccer. Okay, you all have to decide this is basketball. Okay, and then you have to show up at the same place at the same time. Okay, and then divide into teams, and then you start playing. What's interesting about pickup basketball, you don't have a coach. Okay, you can. This is an organic group, you know, activity. But what's interesting, if you study this, groups are very good at if there's no chief calling the shots. Okay, if the group is just left to interact on its own, groups can be very, very good, particularly when they're focused on the same outcome. Like, that's important. Okay, pickup game of basketball, you're all trying to win the basketball game. So that's okay. We're here. We want to win basketball. It's basketball. It's not soccer. Okay, so there's okay. Now let's start playing. And people are very good at reinforcing correct positions for individuals on the team. They're really good at it. Okay, we do it unconsciously. So if someone's a really good forward, we let them know. Now, if someone thinks I'm a guard and they're terrible at it, very quickly the group will encourage them to try a different position and kind of adjust. The group will self-adjust and through social dynamics, encourage people to either do one thing or another so that you can maximize the group performance relative to the game. And like saying, there's things that throw the wrench in the works. One is if you appoint a coach, because suddenly then the coach is making the calls and not the team. So, and I've seen this work. In fact, in the teams that I've led at NASA, I deliberately have done this. One thing I found, okay, and particularly engineers who are used to kind of a traditional approach, one of the things you do is that you do not assign roles when the group first convenes. You don't assign roles. You lay out, here's the project, here's what we're trying to accomplish. Who has some ideas on how we might do this? And you'll often, I've had this happen, often have folks say, well, hold on, I need to know what role am I playing? Well, we'll work that out. Okay, but first we need to decide, you know, do we all agree that this is what we're trying to do? Okay, how are we going to do this? And you start seeing where people show up and where they start self-initiating and contributing. And then you start seeing who really has talent and who doesn't, who can really do one thing and who can do another. And what's amazing is that often your most talented people are the most unassuming. And often the people with the largest mouths and most concerned about what role they have are in many cases the least capable and beneficial. Okay, but if they can secure those roles, okay, then they can benefit from it, even though the team suffers. And so I have found that is a really good way of essentially assembling a team that's really effective at getting a job done, at essentially identifying who are the non-performers. Okay, and you can still have them do something, but don't have them in charge of anyone.
Right. Yeah, exactly. You know, I mean, that's really interesting, you know, and that's also a core element of like the work we've been doing. I'd like to drill in on that a little bit. So do you feel that for that to work, you have to watch very closely? Because in a meeting, very often the most vocal people are not actually the most capable people.
No, they're usually the opposite. Okay, or often the opposite. Okay, the most capable people often are very unassuming, and they, you know, aren't trying to force themselves on anyone. Okay, and so you have to kind of watch. And what I found is that you kind of give assignments that people can work on their own and come back and report on. Okay, because that's when you really see, oh wow, look at this. Okay, because then it doesn't depend on who has the loudest voice. It's okay, who's actually come in with something that's of value. And you watch, and you have to be watching who's really contributing, who's problem solving versus who's distracting and you know and not contributing and trying to usually trying to get resources that they control. I you know, I had one individual, oh God, one as a branch chief, and I was warned about this individual, shall be nameless, was just a nightmare for the previous branch chiefs. In fact, I remember the branch chief that had the job before me spent a whole day with me talking about this one individual because this guy had just turned his world into hell. That and his secretary had told me that after he had a meeting with this guy, that she would clear his calendar, the branch chief calendar, for the rest of the day because he'd be so distraught. Okay, and so he couldn't even interact with anybody for the rest of the day.
Oh my God.
And yeah, so and by the way, and this guy was legend. Okay, by the way, he was a double threat. He was a PhD and had a law degree. He had reduced in force by NASA, but because he had a law degree and NASA didn't follow all the procedures right, he sued and got reinstated with back pay. Okay, so
Wow.
I'm absolutely serious, absolutely serious. And I remember thinking, and this guy was telling me about him. I thought, I think I'll be okay with this guy. Okay, and so anyhow, so I start off at branch chief, and oh, sure enough, he needed to have resources. Okay, if he was gonna, he came in and made all kinds of promises, and to make these promises, he had to have all these resources, all these people reporting to him, these things. And I said, no, I'll tell you what, let's start with some simpler things, some things you can do essentially just on your own. And once you do those, we'll see. And of course, he couldn't do anything on his own. Okay, he couldn't. Literally, I mean, the man could barely answer the phone. I'm serious.
And he had a PhD?
Serious. PhD and a law degree, okay, from prestigious schools too.
Huh.
Okay. So, but and the other thing he had done, he had arranged so his office was right next to the branch chief's office. So he got to watch everyone that was coming in. So he could kind of do, espionage. And so one of the first things I did when I became branch chief, I didn't change his office. I changed my office.
Wow.
I moved my office to where he was no longer outside the door. And he tried to move his office beside mine. Nah, sorry, that's not going to happen. You stay where you are. Okay. So suddenly he was information poor. Okay. And he lobbied me like every week for about the first year that he needed resources. I kept telling him, well, tell you what, I can't give you resources until you show me what you can do on this project. So there's simple things like go do some research and come back with some ideas that are useful. I mean, these were not hard things. These were like entry-level engineering things, and he couldn't do them. He literally couldn't do them. But if he just gave him resources, and so he eventually quit trying, and because he realized that no, I'm never going to give you resources. And he was never, other than taking a couple hours out of my week, for about the first year. But it was never bothered me because okay, fine. I would usually be doing something else. I'm kind of listening to him drone on about all the promises he was going to make, and if I just gave him resources, not going to happen.
Well, when you said that, you give people challenges to
challenge.
Like basic challenges first to see what they can do. Do you feel that you need to look at how they did it, or just look at the result?
No, look at the result. In fact, actually, what's really important and what I found, and it took me a while to get used to this too. People can have very different approaches for achieving a good solution. Okay, and one thing that managers make the mistake of is assuming that you can only get to a good solution by the approach that I, prescribe or understand. And I actually had this happen really early in my career when we were doing it was actually freshman year in college, and we were doing an initial engineering design project, and we broke into teams, and we had to do this design. It was of actually a good design project. Looking back, we had this little mouse that our design instructor, a plastic mouse, okay, a rubber mouse, and we had to design a vehicle using just 2 rubber bands that would transport this mouse the farthest distance. Okay, and we could use anything we want. We couldn't have any auxiliary propulsion or whatever. The propulsion can only be the 2 rubber bands, and the payload was the mouse.
And where did it get its initial energy from?
good question, because it had to start from a standing, from a still position. It couldn't be moving. It had to start from you had to start it moving from a still position, and then until
But
it
could
quit
you
moving
wind
again.
it up? There had to be stored
Yes.
potential
Oh yeah.
energy.
No, you can store the stored
Yeah.
energy was in the rubber band. So you could store energy in the rubber band, but not kinetic. It had to be just potential energy in the rubber band. And so you can do any design you want. And so we broke into groups, like of 4, and so we're doing this design and going through these iterations. In my group, I had an idea for how I thought this would go, and had one other guy in my group who kind of agreed with me, and then there was another guy who thought, no, we should do it this other way, which I didn't quite agree with them. And so him and the other guy in our group kind of decided to go this other way. Went, okay, fine, and we were fine. We were doing ours, they were doing theirs, and when it came to the end of the competition, of course, my design was the one that by the way, my design with my colleague, okay, we went 3 times further than any of the other teams. Okay, I still remember
You
that.
have a flywheel?
We actually used like large records, yeah, and we used the mouse as the weight on a flywheel. So essentially, it was a one-wheeled device. Like, I wanted to minimize the rolling friction. So right,
That's
yeah, the
called
offset
thinking
pendulum.
out of the box.
Exactly, and we had to go through a couple iterations to get to that. We further than the next closest team. Okay, with one caveat: the next design that went half as far as ours was the other guy. Okay, this other guy that had broke off, and he had done a little bit. He had done kind of a 3-wheel device, but so it wasn't quite as good as the 1-wheel, but it was still really good. And I remember thinking, oh, that's interesting. Okay, that yeah, I had a better idea, but his idea wasn't bad, even though his approach was much different. And so that's when I realized, okay, yeah, look at the outcome. Okay, don't now if someone can do it with a Ouija board, great. Okay, but what you're looking for is the outcome, and not trying to direct the approach.